I am a weekly visitor to Villawood Detention Centre, and I know some of the children that have been mentioned in the recently released report by the Australian Human Rights Commission. I know an 8-year-old who attempted suicide by eating rocks and screws and bolts from the tents that he lived in for 14 months on Nauru. I know a 14-year-old who attempted to hang herself. I would ask you personally to justify the irreparable damage that's being done to hundreds of children still in detention.
Okay, well, let me give you a few numbers on this, and can I just say to you, there's a lot of talk about politics and personalities and so forth. The real issue here is the children, and the welfare of the children. But let's just look at a few numbers. When the Howard government was voted out in 2007, there were no children in detention. The Labor Party overturned John Howard's very successful policy on stopping people smuggling. As a consequence, as we know, there were tens of thousands of arrivals. At its peak, under Labor, there were 2,000 children in detention. At the time of the election, when we came into government, there were just under 1,400. Now, there are 136. So we, with our policies, have reduced the number of children in detention by 90%.
Can I just say,
hang on,
first of all, that figure's wrong. Sorry. That figure's wrong. That is the number of...
There's 211 in detention in Australia, and there's 119 in detention in
No, there is 136 children in detention.
I'm reading from the report.
Well,
the report's out of date.
It's out of date. There are 136 as of 12 p.m. today. There are 192 as of last Thursday. There are 1,992 at the peak under Labor in 2013.
I've got to interrupt you again.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is the up-to-date information.
No, there's a misapprehension here because Peter Dutton did release figures of 192 children in detention today, but he left out the children in detention offshore on Nauru.
Exactly.
135 children there.
There are 136 children in detention.
Well,
anyway, look, I'm sorry. I have this information from Peter Dutton himself today. But the bottom line, look, listen, let's not quibble.
Does that mean that all the children in Nauru have been released?
No, but Tony, this is the absurdity of your querulousness. I mean, really, the Labor Party had a massively failed border protection policy, which they abandoned themselves, right? The consequence of that policy was hundreds of people drowning at sea, tens of thousands of people coming to Australia, a couple of thousand children in detention, and what we have done is get most of those children out, and we are getting them out as quickly as we can.
Okay, I'm just...
And that is the truth.
The querulousness was simply about the figures, that's all. Now we're going to hear from Catherine King.
Let's talk about the children.
That's right.
Let's talk about the children.
Exactly.
Catherine King should at least answer the questions you've raised, and they are legitimate questions.
Look, I think the Human Rights Commission report is an indictment on both of us. It is an indictment on both of us. This is not the system. This is not who we are as Australians. And I know that the Labor Party in government, we did try to have a more compassionate policy, and yes, we did see a large number of boats arrive, and that did mean there are a lot of people in detention. But now we have a Human Rights Commission report before us that says there are children suffering today because they are in detention. Now, the response of the government, which you have just echoed then, is to then go and, well, Labor did this, Labor did that, and then to blame the Human Rights Commissioner and attack her.
I haven't said anything about her at all.
You haven't, and I acknowledge that you haven't, and as a lawyer I suspect you would be very careful about doing so as well. But the Prime Minister, who is your leader, has done exactly that. That's the response of the government. What the response of the government should be is about, well, what are we doing to get them out? How are we actually making them safe? What do we need to do?
But can I just ask you, just on Malcolm Turnbull's point, there are almost 2,000 children in detention at the peak of your government's policy on this issue. Why wasn't that the fundamental debate that you and others were fighting at the time you were in government? Well, why is it only now out of government that this has become a huge issue for you?
Many of us internally were, and that's exactly, you are right to raise that. And I know that there was work being done to get them out as quickly as possible. Is that good enough? Clearly the Human Rights report says no.
Brian, I'm just going to bring you in as an outsider. I sidelined you for most of the political leadership debate because it didn't seem fair. But can you reflect on what you've seen here? Children in detention, did you expect to find that in Australia?
Well, it troubles me, but I think that, you know, this is not an uncommon debate. I mean, we have suffered in America from the politics of fear and anger, where people posture politically around a big issue and that there are casualties in the middle, and I think that's what's happened here. So I do think that the challenge really has to be, how do we protect children? And it doesn't, from my perspective, of course, I'm not an Australian, it doesn't matter sort of who the political party is, it doesn't matter how we got here, we've got to figure out how we get where we are, from where we are to where we want to go. And no child should be under these conditions and circumstances. We've got some 3,000 children in adult jails and prisons, and it's horrific. The suicide rate is through the roof. Kids are traumatized. They are scarred in ways that we are responsible for putting children in that situation. So I think it's an immediate question of how do we get out of that. And there's some really good programs around the world. Refugee children in many societies are shielded from whatever the immigration policy is that's going to create suffering and abuse. So we've got some programs in the States where we actually pull children. We put them in schools, we provide them with services, we offer them counseling, we facilitate relationships with their parents, even if they're undocumented and illegal. I think you always, in a just society, have an obligation to protect children. In some ways, it's society's first obligation. And all children are children. It doesn't matter whether they're born in another country. It doesn't matter if their parents came to the country illegally. They're children. And if you don't protect children, you are really sowing the seeds of a society that's at risk with itself. I don't think you should do nothing except quarrel about the politics that give rise to these policies. That's a recipe for sustaining the problem. And I think in many ways there are some immediate things that could be done. And I think the Human Rights Commission report painted a picture that might have allowed that to happen. I do think it's a mistake to silence the reporting of these kinds of problems, even if it's a little out of date, because it can create a sort of resolve to shield a country from these problems replicating.
Yes, I'd like to hear on Gillian Trigg's report specifically, because we're running out of time, and I want to hear... let me just put it as a question. Do you share Tony Abbott's view the Children in Detention report was a blatantly partisan, politicised exercise?
Look, I'm not going to buy into that. The real issue is the children.
So when you say you're not going to buy into it...
I'm not going to run a commentary on my colleagues. I just want to make this... I just want to make a very important point. And I've discussed this at some length with the Immigration Minister, Peter Dutton, today, who has been successful, as indeed was Scott Morrison, in getting kids out of detention. The reason children are in detention is obviously they're with their families, their mother and father, typically. The reason why they're still there, in most cases, is because the mother and the children have been offered the opportunity to move out of detention, but do not want to leave the father in detention, and the father is the authorities may wish to keep him in detention because of security issues and matters of that kind. So that is the look, I'm just telling you what the Immigration Minister, both of them, have said to me about this. They are absolutely working very hard to get all of these kids out of detention, and I'm not suggesting that you send them a bunch of flowers, but you've got to give them credit. They've reduced the number of children in detention by 90%. By 90%. Now, we want it to be 100%, and we're going to do our very level best to get there. So please believe, we all have children, or we were children. We've got enough empathy to understand how dreadful it must be for children to be in detention. It is our objective to have no children in detention. And of course, the best way to do that is to stop this people smuggling trade. Because see, the problem that Catherine's party had was that while people like Chris Bowen were moving kids out of detention at one end, out the back door, if you like, the people smuggler boats were coming, bringing more children in the front door. Now, we've managed to close that, and so we can now move the children out. And
when will the children be out?
Well, as quickly as possible. But you see, can I just say to you, I'm not asking that you send Dutton and Morrison, a bouquet or a Christmas card or anything like that. But you've got to give the Abbott government credit for having reduced the number of children in detention by 90%. I mean, we left government in 07, there were no children in detention. Labor ended up with 2,000. When they went out, there was just under 1,400. Now there's 136. Now, you know, that is progress. It's not 100%, I grant you, but you've got to give us some credit for taking this issue seriously and addressing it in a way that Labor plainly did not.
All right, we've got to move on. Malcolm.
Yeah, very quickly. The problem is the response to this Human Rights Commission report coming out was it was all about the politics. Now, the irony is this report was called The Forgotten Children, and all of the rhetoric forgot the children.
I hope it's quite clear. You should... Look, can I just say this, Lisa? Judge us by our actions. The one thing that is clear is that as a government we have not forgotten the children because we are moving them out. There were 192 last week, 136 now, and there'll be less the next week. It is, I promise you, Peter Dutton is focused on getting those kids out of detention as quickly as he can.
And you